Hi everyone, I'm making a small video about the post on Twitter by Alan Dean. So he's commenting that the very first community process governance action has expired. Only 3 out of 7 constitutional committee seats could be bothered to cast a vote. What do you think those were? So I have a few things to say about this, and I don't usually do a Twitter discourse on this, but there was feedback from with context from Cardano Foundation, and then I said that I think it's important with full context, not only to those who did not vote when you are participating in such a public discourse. Before I start, I would like to preface with I have every faith in the CC, the individual constitutional council members in the interim constitution, that all of them have probably worked a lot on this. I know for sure I have personally, and this is more like my own general comments and thoughts. So why vote, even abstain, but not abstain to vote? One of the main reasons why I think we should have participatory governance also for the CC on info actions is that without this participatory governance, you are creating less public discourse and development. It does also create a void in information as to why you did not vote. So for those council members who did not vote, probably it's nice if they come out with some information to why that is the case, and especially now in these early days when we are still developing governance on Cardano, I think it's actually quite important. Not only preventive, but just for effective governance, so just for everyone to understand the process and what thoughts went into the process. And I think just for historical reasons as well, it will be nice to show the community as well that you are participating, you're developing your skill, you're demonstrating it, even if it means to abstain vote with a rationale to why you are abstaining. And I really like that that option was there, and there was a lot of debate on having that option there, just to be able to show to the public, like sometimes it's not a yes or a no answer, but you have to abstain, but there's a reason why you're abstaining. So having that rationale is good. Then let's be clear on what is really the responsibility. So, like, if you look at what is the responsibility of the Constitutional Council, so that is in Article 6, and it's in Section 1. It's really to establish as a branch of the Cardano's on-chain governance process that ensures governance actions are consistent with this interim constitution. And you, as a constitutional committee, you should be a set of ADA holders that is collectively responsible for ensuring that on-chain governance actions prior to enactment on-chain are constitutional. So you're judging the constitutionality of governance action. And that's what it says in the next line. You are limited to this. So constitutional committee shall be limited to voting the constitutionality of governance action. So that is important. And then let's ask ourselves the question, is an info action a governance action? So if you look at participatory governance, here you are, Section 5. It's a special form of governance action, but indeed it is a governance action. So it is within the remit of the Constitutional Committee to look at the constitutionality of governance actions. So you should probably look at the constitutionality of info actions as well. And there are some good reasons for this. So if you look at it, it's like, let's just start with like a textual interpretation of the Constitution in itself. So even already here in Section 6 of Article 3, any governance action submitted, that includes a special form of governance actions, such as info actions, should, for approval, shall require. So there are a few standards every governance action submitted, or any governance action submitted to $8 for approval shall require. So they need a standardized and legible format, including an URL and a hash linked to document off-chain. And there's a lot of good reasons for this. Like, let's say you have info actions that were used for a poll, but you change the poll and the hash is different suddenly. Like you ruin the legitimacy of the info action as a special form of governance action that's meant to be allow community sentiment. if you change the rules. And it's like when we have these polls where Ada Whale jumps in and says, nice poll, and then they just change the rules of the whole poll after Cardano community have won. Like, you don't do that. That ruins the legitimacy of that info action or that poll in this case. And it's the same for governance actions on Cardano. And then you have the literal interpretation in terms of like effects on the Cardano blockchain. So sufficient rationale should be provided to justify the requested change to the Cardano blockchain. So that's actually a textual interpretation question. Does this mean only the on-chain effects on the Cardano blockchain, or does it affect also, like, more pragmatically, the legitimacy of the Cardano blockchain? So let's say, for example, you had a naming action, and that name action was to change the hard fork to be named like Torture Charles or something like that, like something insane, something everyone will agree that this is a universally bad name. Uh, Maybe there are some limits to what you can do also in info actions, if they will have some effect, even if it's socially on the blockchain. And you could argue that the social effects then have technical effects. So if you never could agree to the name of a hard fork, wouldn't that also cause us to have a problem with actually proposing a hard fork? I think so. So that could potentially fracture the community, and I think very much that should be in the remit of the Constitutional Council. So this is an example of moving from a pure textual interpretations to a more pragmatical interpretation where you think about the consequences of how you judge things. So if we left out all info actions and we never voted on them as constitutional members, like, what will happen? We create a void, an information void where there are no rules, and we potentially hurt the legitimacy of those governance action and that info action as a tool in part of governance. So I want a world where even if you live in a completely different place than me, you are able to on-chain try to develop some form of process. And for our case, it's a process for naming hard forks. But more importantly, like, we already have a process that's established that will be used by the info action. It's the budget process. So budget processes has to pass through as an info action with a certain threshold. This is in the interim. So if you look at interim 04 in the treasury, let's see if we can find it here. Interim. Here we go. Or it's in the treasury interim. Treasury budget. Here we go. A treasury withdrawal must not be ratified until there's a community-approved Cardano budget that is in effect pursuant to a previous on-chain governance action, agreed by the DReps with a threshold greater than 50% of the active voting threshold. The way the current governance system works, that has to be through the info action to poll for that budget. Or you could even argue that it could possibly be from the info action, so thus any such info actions would have to be judged for their constitutionality. If not, we will pass a budget, again, pragmatically interpretation, like, what effects would that have on Cardano governments? We would pass a budget without oversight if that budget had constitutionality or not. And does that matter? Yes, it does matter. So we have, for example, a rule that you need auditability for treasury withdrawals. So let's say we look at treasury withdrawals. There is a rule for that already in the interim constitution. So let's look at that during participatory governance. Here we go, section 8. Any governance action requesting ADA from the Cardano treasury in excess of 1,000 ADA should require an allocation of ADA as part of such funding requests to cover the cost of periodic independent audits and the implementation of oversight country as use of such either. And then we come to a third point, like pragmatically, but also what creates effective governance. So if you have to vote through a budget info action and the CCs can remain like, we don't want to face that reality, we don't want to talk about the budget info action, then what happens is you are creating extra bureaucracy, because then when the treasury withdrawal action happens, then they have to take action on that budget info action. And then all that work could be wasted if then the CC says, look, this is unconstitutional. So instead of having it already clarified during the budget info action, you then create another budget action with all the work involved in that before the CC watch in. So that to me is not effective governance. It does not make sense. So yeah, let's run through it. So we talked about the strict textual, and even in the strict textual, you could look at Article 6 and comment that it should still be strictly from the textual wording itself be judged for constitutionality infractions. Then pragmatically, we run through that. There are good reasons pragmatically. And then effective governance, we run through that. And then there's a fourth point, like what could potentially be harmful to the Cardano blockchain, and should a CC have that as its remit? So for that, you would probably have to go through like the more purpose of the constitution and why we have it in the first place. But and there are clearly limits to how far a CC should go into that. But if something potentially could fracture the community, let's say that the community had real problems with establishing a process for naming hard forks, wouldn't it be helpful for the community to see what's the CC opinion about naming hard forks? And more broadly, if we have accepted that the budget info action can cause a budget to pass, why are we shutting the door for other info actions in the future to create processes such as naming hard forks or other processes by not voting on them? I think that's actually really important. Like, we should not shut the door for info actions to create processes. Yes, they are community sentiment gauge, and they don't have an on or off chain effect in themselves, but they could have an effect on other governance actions. So if we open the door for that for budget processes, why are we closing that door for other info actions or other future processes? I think it's wise that we allow processes to develop on chain with info action. That's a lot more transparent and visible than only allowing it to be off chain and then changing the constitution to allow for these special types of info actions to be valid as more than just an info action. That's my opinion. It's more effective governance again. Again, and also ask yourself like the question: what happens if we are enacting, like not acting on info actions? So what happens if we do not vote on a budget info action the community wants? That's pretty bad. We already covered that a bit. What happens if we do not vote on the info action to make names for hardfork and the community wanted it? So the DReps wanted it, the SPOs wanted that name, but the CC have not made any comment on it. Well, what would happen is they will then have to turn that info action into another action, and they have to make clear that this is now the process. Maybe that's a good thing, but why not vote in on it as a CC already? Because what you do if you vote in your opinion, you clarify a bit more for the DRep and the SPOs what to expect from an info action. So I will briefly look at the the intersect council as I work with that, but again, it's not about my opinion. This is more broadly about like how this works as a system I'm talking about. But doesn't that create a problem that we don't vote on this? Like we created a much harder system for the DReps and the SPOs to guess how do the CC react to this. That just makes it another step, another unnecessary step. Then, if we accept that the info action can be used for actions that affect on future actions, such as the budget info action, do we not close the door on the community making other such processes if we don't act upon those types of info actions? Maybe that's. I think that's a very interesting perspective to have. And then again, like textually, if it's also in the scope of info actions, that they're also governance actions, are we not like even not respecting the constitution itself by holding those governance actions? And info actions seems to be governance action as per section 5 and 6 of participatory governance, that has to be held to some standards. Should we not also then voice our opinion on the standards, especially in the early days of when community governance is developing and people are feeling each other out? What are all those standards? Like, what does really standardized and legible format mean? Does it has to be the specific URL that's in zip 100 or 108, or is there something else to it? That's exactly why you voice your opinion, so that the public discourse can run its course and you can have clarity on that. And that will be the case for a lot of these technical standards that will develop. And some might even think that this is in the purview of the CC. If they are allowed to check an info action for its constitutionality, maybe they are allowed to decide if they want to look at this info action for its constitutionality or not. But how do we hold the CC responsible? Maybe we require some form of transparency. So if you have to vote, abstain, and give a rationale, you are giving the community a whole lot more transparency and accountability than if you just choose to step away from it and do nothing. Maybe there's great reasons to why you did that, but unless you're voting a rationale to why, it's harder to be transparent about it. So also in that type of remit, you're giving the CC a power to vote on the constitutionality, to hold the CC accountable to that power. Then at least if they vote no, you should, and probably you should during these early days when there's a lot of standards being developed and a lot of public discourse being developed on Cardano. I'm not saying that is in the constitution that you should also when it's voting yes or abstaining, but I'm saying there's good reasons to why that will create more transparency. So then it's up to the burden of evidence to say, like, in this case, it was not needed, this transparency, because of this reason X, Y, Z, Y. So, or we had 1,000 governance actions and we simply did not have the time and we prioritized these 2 governance actions. But in our case, there's so few governance actions, so why not? Yeah, so I have a lot on my heart, but let me now briefly show our rationale and like try to think a bit about the reasoning for it. So in our case, we say that the Chang hardfork is constitutional. We look at the format, because there is some format rules in section 6. We establish that it doesn't have anything to do with zip 100 or 108. It's not specified what standard you should follow, or if you should follow both or not. It's not obligatory. So that's already legal clarity. So that's already a useful reason to voice in on this opinion. And I believe no one has so far challenged that you can access this information. It is hashable. So for me, that seems like a very useful thing to comment on. Just for that fact alone, you should be having a comment on this info action. Then we establish it's a poll for sentiment. It's Article 3, Section 5. So again, special form of governance action. Then we say that what type of special form of governance action is this? Because there is already this budget info action that's having an effect on future governance action. And we establish here, no, this is not that type of governance action. There's no specific mention of requiring names of hard forks in the interim constitution. And then I think we do something that's important for the community again. It's up for the community to establish such process or defining them in a final constitution. For me, this is effective governance, because you as a CC have voiced your opinion in on something that, look, it's in our remit to voice on the constitutionality of something, but here we have identified there's no process for this. So this info action is purely a poll of sentiment, and it's not binding for a future governance action on naming the hard fork. And that's super useful, because it helps not create fracture in the community. We have said that, look, there is no current such established standard, and B, we identify the issue for the rest of the community that, look, you might want to have a standard for such naming in the future, or else, like, what happens when you don't have a standard that you can agree upon in terms of how you name things and how you deal with things? Well, you risk having more fracture in that community. So I think it's useful to mention this and to show this to the community. Then we establish, look, when we vote on the info action, we do not have an opinion about it. It's not if it's a great hosky action or not. It's if it's constitutional or not. We're looking at the process of constitutionality, like, does it fill all its process requirements? Is it standardized? Does it have a URL and hash? And number two, what's the governance effect of this info action? Is it binding for a future governance action, or is it just a poll for sentiment? Is there some limits to what you can poll the sentiment about, or is there some limits to how you name things? That is probably useful to see the opinion of the various CC members on for the rest of the community. And then we come to the actual rationale. We have established here 3 facts: that it's valid proposal in terms of its structure and format, it's a poll for sentiment, and we as a CC are not judging its sentiment. We are not caring if it's a great thing that hosky, the name is hosky or Chang. We are voting on its constitutionality. So then we come to the rationale. Is it sufficient rationale for an info action on naming a hardfork for it to be constitutional? So we're talking here about shall require a standard and legible format, and sufficient rationale be provided to justify the requested change to the Cardano blockchain. So there's 2 things here. So if you just have a natural language interpretation of this in section 6, it means to it's related only to actual on-chain change. So the actual hard fork parameter itself, or the change to enable a hard fork. But if you have a wider interpretation where also things that relates to the actual on-chain action has an effect. For example, in our case, we suggest that if something is universal and objectively offensive, torture person X, that's the name of the hard fork, that might harm the legitimacy of Cardano. That might not be a good idea. There might be some limits to any such process that the community develops. And I think that is legal clarity for the community to understand that this CC member here thinks that there is some wider definition of Cardano blockchain. It's not just the technical on-chain, but the Cardano blockchain as a whole, as a human system that affects it and has limits to it. And also just the info action itself in the constitution is said to be community sentiment gauging. So it's a tool, it's a special types of governance action meant to get community sentiment. So if we broke that tool and its intended function, that in itself might cause it to be unconstitutional. So example, if we have 2000 info action that are all commercials, like buy Polkadot, buy Ethereum, it's a massive amount of them, and it's really hard to get the info action that is actual community sentiment polls, not just commercials. Maybe that is problematic for info actions to exist as a special form of governance action to allow community sentiment. So there might be some limits to what goes into an info action. And already then you have established there's a reason to want to judge in on the opinion about info actions. And as we said, like, they could have binding effect on further governance actions. So we know that the Treasury already has a threshold of 50% of active state voting yes. And then it's a requirement for a Treasury withdrawal to be ratified. So those type of budget info actions do have an effect on a future action itself. And here we argue that it's not a requirement currently for a hard fork to have a previous process. But I think the really important argument here is that we have established already that there's one type of info action that can cause an effect on other other info actions. In this case, the budget info action. It helps the budget process. Why are we closing the door for the community through on-chain actions? Because the info actions are on the chain, they're visible for everyone, to establish other processes. How are we to say that there will not be other processes developed by the community? Clearly, a constitution cannot cover all of the potential processes that will be developed by the community. Why should we not then look at these and look if the community wants it to establish a process? I mean, the info action could be that we propose that info actions in the future will name hard forks, and it will be based on these criterions. Do the community agree on such a naming process? Alright, then the info action has potentially created a process. That in itself says to me that the Constitutional Council should also accept that if there's one form of governance action, info action that can bind other actions, there might be others, so we should judge their constitutionality. We then conclude that the rationale, that's one of the requirements in section 6, is sufficient. We say there's no current technical standards. I think this is also hugely important. Like, there's so many places in the Constitution where it's talks about the standard, and that standard needs to be developed by the community. But if the CC does not vote in their opinion that, look, this is a standard that currently has little substance, then the community, how should the community then know what that standard evolves, and how do we as a community evolve that standard? I think it's valuable that the CC identifies that there's currently no technical standard for naming proposal, and that means it's currently constitutional, but it's up to the community to establish such standards. And we also point out precedent discussion, all of the history. 2 recent hardforks have been named after community members. Vasil, in memory of him, and all of his ginkgo trees and everything planted, and the amazing person he was, and then Phil Chang, all he did as a researcher for IOG. Again, we don't really have a process for naming hardforks after this Chang hardfork, when it's now participatory governance, where everyone has a say in this, but probably it should be established by the community, and that's why it's valuable to say that this is a constitutional info action. It currently fulfills their standards for a naming hard fork process, but it's up to the community to fill that that process with more content. Just as we have done with the budget info action process, we might do the same for naming processes in the future as well. Hope that was useful. Thank you.